The morning sun barely peeked through the diner's windows as Mai wiped down the counter for the 100th time that day. The familiar scent of coffee and pancakes filled the air, mixing with the quiet chatter of early morning customers. Her reflection in the freshly cleaned surface showed dark circles under her eyes, evidence of another late night spent dreaming of a different life. The Golden Pearl Diner wasn't much to look at, with its worn leather booths and slightly crooked sign, but it had been Mi's workplace for the past 10 years. She knew every crack in the tile floor, every regular customer's usual order, and exactly how many steps it took to get from the kitchen to the furthest booth. 28 steps, to be exact. She'd counted them during countless trips carrying plates of steaming food. "Order up," called out Mr. Wu from the kitchen window, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. Mai quickly grabbed the plates. 2 sunny side-up eggs with extra crispy hash browns for the businessman in booth 3, and a stack of blueberry pancakes for the retired teacher who came in every Tuesday. As she balanced the plates with practiced ease, her mind wandered to the violin sitting in its case back home. It was a beautiful instrument, passed down from her grandmother, who had played in her hometown's local orchestra. The case now sat in the corner of her tiny apartment, gathering dust like the memories of standing on stage at the conservatory, her heart soaring with each note she played. That was before everything changed. Before her father's medical bills ate through their savings, before she had to trade sheet music for order pads, and concert halls for the clattering symphony of dishes and silverware. The diner had started as a temporary solution, a way to make ends meet. But temporary had stretched into years, and here she was, still wearing the same pale blue uniform with a notebook full of breakfast orders instead of musical notes. "Hey, sweetie, can I get a refill?" A regular customer held up his empty coffee cup, pulling her back to reality. Mai nodded with a gentle smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. She had mastered the art of being present while her mind danced with memories of Mozart and Beethoven. Between refilling coffee cups and taking orders, she found herself unconsciously tapping out rhythm patterns on her serving tray. First position, second position. Her fingers remembered the movements even after all these years. Sometimes, during the quiet moments before the breakfast rush, she would catch herself humming classical pieces while setting up the tables, her movements flowing like she was still part of an orchestra. The other waitresses noticed how she moved differently. There was a grace to her steps that seemed out of place in the busy diner. Even when juggling multiple plates or dealing with grumpy customers, she maintained a certain poise that made her stand out. It was as if she was performing on a different stage, one where coffee cups were her instruments and customer service her reluctant area. At the end of her morning shift, Mai counted her tips, mostly $1 bills and scattered coins. They clinked in her apron pocket like a melancholy melody, each one representing another small step away from her dreams. But today, something felt different. As she watched a young girl excitedly tell her mother about her first piano lesson while eating pancakes, something stirred in Mai's heart. A forgotten spark, a whisper of possibility. She glanced at her watch. Still enough time before her evening shift to stop by home. Maybe today, instead of collapsing onto her bed for a quick nap, she would open that dusty violin case. Maybe today, she would remember what it felt like to create something beautiful, something that was entirely her own. The winter morning bit hard through Mai's worn jacket as she hurried to open the diner. Frost covered the windows like delicate lace, and her breath came out in small clouds as she fumbled with the keys. Inside, the heating system groaned to life, fighting against the bitter cold that had settled into every corner during the night. Today felt different from the start. The coffee machine was acting up, the morning delivery was late, and her feet already ached from the previous day's double shift. But it was the customer in booth 7 who would turn this ordinary morning into something else entirely. He was a businessman type, complete with an expensive suit and a laptop that took up half the table. The moment Mai set down his coffee, she knew something was off. The cup barely touched the table before he started complaining. "This coffee is barely lukewarm," he snapped, not even looking up from his screen. I don't have time for this kind of incompetence. Mi's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the cup. I'm very sorry, sir. I'll bring you a fresh one right away. But that wasn't enough for him. For the next 5 minutes, he lectured her about customer service, his voice getting louder with each word. Other customers started to stare, some with pity, others pretending not to notice. Something inside Mai cracked. Not because of his words, she'd heard worse before. It was the way he spoke to her, like she was nothing more than a malfunctioning coffee machine. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her steps carrying her past the kitchen, past Mr. Wu's concerned glance, and into the storage room. The storage room was her sanctuary during tough moments. Boxes of napkins and containers of silverware surrounded her as she sank to the floor, her back against a shelf of cleaning supplies. The fluorescent light flickered above, and the distant sound of dishes clattering filtered through the door. Then, without thinking, she started humming. It was Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, the piece she performed at her last recital before leaving the conservatory. The melody flowed from her lips naturally, filling the small space with invisible music. Her fingers moved on their own, muscle memory taking over as they played imaginary strings in the air. As she hummed, memories flooded back. The weight of the violin on her shoulder, the perfect balance of the bow in her hand, the way time seemed to stop when she played. She remembered how the music made her feel, powerful, graceful, worthy. In those moments on stage, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was an artist, creating something beautiful that touched people's hearts. The door creaked open, and Lynn, another waitress, poked her head in. Hey, you okay? That guy was a real piece of work. She paused, noticing Mi's hands still positioned as if holding a violin. What were you playing just now? It sounded pretty. Mai quickly dropped her hands, embarrassed at being caught. But Lynn's genuine interest made her pause. It's a violin concerto, she explained softly. I used to play, before all this. Used to? Why'd you stop? Lynn sat down beside her, genuinely curious. It was the first time anyone at the diner had asked about her past. The question hung in the air, and Mai realized she didn't have a good answer anymore. The usual excuses about money and responsibilities suddenly felt hollow. The music was still inside her, waiting to come out. It had always been there, through every coffee spill and rude customer, through every long shift and aching night. Standing up, Mai brushed off her uniform. The businessman would still be out there, probably complaining about the delay. But something had shifted inside her. The melody still echoed in her mind, and with it came a determination she hadn't felt in years. I need to get back out there, she said, straightening her name tag. But as she reached for the door handle, she made a decision. Tonight, after her shift, she would unpack her violin. She would play, even if it was just for a few minutes, even if her fingers were clumsy and her technique rusty. Because the person who played that concerto wasn't gone. She had just been waiting for the right moment to return. The alarm buzzed at 4 a.m., its quiet sound enough to wake Mai from her light sleep. For a moment, she lay there in the darkness, listening to the distant hum of early morning traffic and the gentle whir of her old heating unit. Her muscles ached from yesterday's shift, begging her to go back to sleep, but something stronger pulled her out of bed. In the dim light of her bedside lamp, she opened the violin case that had sat untouched for so long. The familiar scent of rosin and wood brought tears to her eyes. Her grandmother's violin still looked beautiful, its maple wood glowing softly in the lamplight. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it, testing its weight, both foreign and familiar at the same time. The laundry room in the basement was her only option for practice. At this hour, it was always empty, the washing machines silent sentinels in the fluorescent light. She'd brought down a folding chair and a music stand she'd found at a thrift store, setting up her own tiny concert hall between the dryers and detergent dispensers. The first notes were awful, scratchy and out of tune. Her fingers, calloused from years of carrying plates and wiping tables, felt clumsy on the strings. But she kept playing, adjusting her grip, remembering how it felt to hold the bow properly. Simple scales at first, the kind she'd learned as a child. Up and down, again and again, until her arm remembered the proper movement. Days turned into weeks. Every morning, she would sneak down to the laundry room, playing until her fingers hurt and her shoulders ached. Sometimes, she'd catch her reflection in the washing machine door, hair messy from sleep, still in her pajamas, but with a look of intense concentration that transformed her entire face. She kept a jar on her kitchen counter, dropping in every tip she could spare. It wasn't much. $1 here, 50 cents there. But it grew slowly, like her confidence with the violin. Some days, she'd skip her morning coffee or walk instead of taking the bus, adding the saved money to her jar. One morning, while counting her tips at the diner, she overheard a customer talking about their neighbor, a retired musician who gave lessons. Mi's heart raced as she wrote down the phone number, tucking it carefully into her pocket like a precious secret. Mrs. Chen, no relation, lived in a small apartment filled with music books and the lingering scent of jasmine tea. She was tiny but fierce, with sharp eyes that softened when she saw May's violin case. "Show me what you remember," she said simply, gesturing for May to play. Mi's hands trembled as she played a simple piece she'd been practicing. When she finished, Mrs. Chen was silent for a long moment. "Your fingers are stiff," she finally said, "but your heart still remembers the music." She agreed to teach Mai, working around her diner schedule and accepting payments from her tip jar. The lessons were hard. Mrs. Chen was demanding, but she understood something about May that others didn't. "Music isn't just about the right notes," she would say, adjusting Mi's posture. "It's about finding your voice when the world wants you to be quiet." Back in the laundry room, Mai practiced everything Mrs. Chen taught her. Her fingers grew stronger, more confident. The scratchy sounds became smoother, more musical. Sometimes she'd hear footsteps above and pause, worried about disturbing her neighbors. But one morning, an elderly resident caught her packing up. "Don't stop," he said with a smile. It's been years since this building had its own musician. Between shifts at the diner, Mai would find moments to practice without her violin. She'd tap out rhythms on the counter during slow periods, run through fingerings while waiting for orders, and listen to classical music on her phone during breaks. Her coworkers noticed a change in her. There was a new energy about her, a spark that hadn't been there before. One evening, after a particularly good lesson, Mrs. Chen made an extra cup of jasmine tea. "You know," she said, watching Mai pack up her violin, "there's a small community concert next month. Nothing fancy, just local musicians sharing their music. Would you be interested?" The question hung in the air like a musical note, full of possibility. Life had become a delicate dance between two worlds. In the early morning hours, Mai filled the laundry room with classical music, her violin singing stories of hope and determination. By sunrise, she was back in her pale blue uniform, pouring coffee and taking orders at the Golden Pearl Diner. But something had changed. The person beneath the uniform was different now. During quiet moments at work, she would study sheet music hidden beneath the order pad. Her fingers would silently practice difficult passages while she waited for the kitchen to prepare orders, earning curious glances from regular customers. One morning, an elderly man caught her tapping out a rhythm on her serving tray. "Bach's Minuet in G," he asked with a knowing smile. Mai blushed, surprised that someone had recognized the pattern. The diner's routine took on a musical quality of its own. The sizzle of bacon on the grill became her percussion section, the clinking of coffee cups her wind chimes. She found herself moving through the busy breakfast rush like it was a choreographed dance, timing her steps to match the rhythms playing in her head. Her coworkers noticed a change in her presence. Gone was the tired slouch and defeated expression. Even on the busiest days, When her feet ached and customers were at their most demanding, May carried herself with a quiet grace. Lynn, who had found her in the storage room that winter morning, would sometimes catch her humming between orders. "You seem different lately," Lynn said one afternoon as they restocked napkin dispensers. "Happier, somehow. Like you found something you lost." Me just smiled, thinking of the violin waiting for her at home and the calluses forming on her fingertips. Different from the ones she'd earned carrying plates. The community performances Mrs. Chen had mentioned became a regular part of May's life. Every other weekend, she would join a small group of musicians at the local community center. They weren't professionals. There was a high school music teacher, a retired accountant who played cello, and a young mother with a flute. But when they played together, none of that mattered. One Saturday, after playing Dvorak's American Quartet with the group, May returned to her evening shift at the diner, still glowing from the performance. The joy must have been visible on her face because Mr. Wu, who rarely commented on anything beyond kitchen orders, stopped her in the hallway. "My mother was a musician back home," he said, surprising her with this personal detail. "She always said that music gives people wings." He paused, looking at her closely. "I see those wings growing on you now." The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. The breakfast rush was in full swing when Mai noticed a familiar face. One of the musicians from her weekend performances had walked in with his family. For a moment, she froze, worlds colliding. Would he say something? Would the other customers look at her differently if they knew? But as she approached their table, notepad ready, the musician simply smiled and ordered his breakfast like any other customer. When she brought their food, his young daughter tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, isn't that the lady who played the pretty music yesterday?" The question hung in the air, and Mai felt her cheeks warm. But instead of embarrassment, she felt a surge of pride. "Yes," she said, straightening her shoulders. "I play violin." The words felt right, natural, as if they had always been part of her introduction. That evening, as she counted her tips, Mai found a note scribbled on the back of a receipt. "Your music yesterday was beautiful. Never stop playing." It wasn't signed, but she knew who had left it. She carefully folded the note and tucked it into her violin case, next to the old photo of her grandmother holding the same instrument. The next morning, she added a small touch to her uniform. A tiny silver violin pin on her collar. It was barely noticeable, but it felt like a declaration. She was no longer just a waitress trying to play music. She was a musician who happened to serve coffee, and both parts of her life were equally worthy of dignity and respect. The notice hung on the community center bulletin board, its crisp white paper standing out among the faded flyers. City Symphony Orchestra. Open auditions for second violin section. Mai must have read it 20 times during her weekly practice session, each time feeling her heart beat a little faster. Mrs. Chen noticed her distraction during their lesson that evening. "You've seen the notice," she said, not really a question. "You should audition." When Mai started to protest, listing all the reasons why she couldn't, her job, her lack of professional experience, her old violin, Mrs. Chen held up her hand. "The music doesn't care about any of that. The music only asks if you can speak its language." The next few weeks became a blur of intense preparation. Mai practiced until her fingers were raw and her shoulders ached. She used her breaks at the diner to study the required orchestral excerpts, propping her phone against the napkin holder to read through the music while she ate. The morning of the audition arrived with a steady drizzle that seemed determined to dampen everything, including Mi's spirits. She had just finished her breakfast shift, and there hadn't been time to change out of her uniform. A coffee stain marked her sleeve from a customer's bumped elbow, and her comfortable work shoes felt suddenly inadequate. The concert hall lobby was filled with other musicians, all clutching instrument cases and sheet music. They looked so polished in their professional attire, making quiet small talk about conservatories and previous orchestra positions. Mai found a quiet corner to unpack her grandmother's violin, trying to ignore the whispers and curious glances at her diner uniform. A young man with an expensive-looking violin case sat down beside her. "First time auditioning?" he asked kindly. May nodded, her throat too tight for words. "Me too," he admitted. "Though I've been preparing for this my whole life. Just finished my master's at the conservatory." He paused, noticing her uniform. "Did you? Come straight from work?" Before she could answer, the door opened and a staff member called her name. Mai stood, gripping her violin case like a lifeline. As she walked toward the audition room, she heard someone whisper, "Is she really wearing a waitress uniform?" The audition room was larger than she expected, with high ceilings that seemed to disappear into shadows above. 3 people sat at a table, their faces neutral as they looked up from their papers. "You'll begin with the Mozart excerpt, then we'll move to the Brahms symphony," one of them said, not unkindly. Mai took a deep breath, thinking of all the mornings in the laundry room, of Mrs. Chen's patient guidance, of the music that had kept her spirit alive through countless diner shifts. She lifted her grandmother's violin to her shoulder, feeling its familiar weight. The coffee stain on her sleeve caught her eye, and instead of feeling ashamed, she felt a surge of pride. This was who she was, all of who she was. The first notes of Mozart filled the room, clear and true. Mai played with everything she had, pouring years of silent dreams and quiet determination into every phrase. She thought of the breakfast rush at the diner, how she'd learned to stay calm and focused in chaos. She thought of her grandmother, who had played this very violin in her hometown orchestra, proving that music belonged to everyone who loved it enough to work for it. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Then one of the judges leaned forward. "That was unexpected," she said, studying Mai with new interest. "Your technique needs refinement, but there's something in your playing, a quality we don't often hear. Where did you study?" "I started at the local conservatory," Mai replied honestly, "but had to leave after 2 years. I've been working at a diner since then, but I never stopped loving music. I've been taking lessons again, practicing whenever I can." The judges exchanged looks she couldn't quite read. "You understand, this would be a significant commitment?" another judge asked. "The schedule can be demanding." "I understand," Mai said, standing a little straighter. "I'm used to hard work and music. Music is what makes everything else worthwhile." As she packed up her violin, her hands shaking slightly, she realized something important. Whether she got the position or not, she had just played her heart out in a professional concert hall, in her waitress uniform, with a coffee stain on her sleeve. And she had made those judges really listen. Whatever happened next, no one could take that moment away from her. The envelope sat unopened on Mi's kitchen table for almost an hour after she got home from her morning shift. Her hands trembled slightly as she finally picked it up, the logo of the City Symphony Orchestra gleaming in the corner. Inside was a single sheet of paper that would change everything. She had been accepted as a part-time member of the second violin section. Life took on a new rhythm after that. Mornings still meant serving coffee and making small talk with regulars at the Golden Pearl Diner, but evenings transformed her into a different person entirely. She would rush home after her shift, trading her comfortable work shoes for dress flats and her blue uniform for concert black. The first orchestra rehearsal nearly overwhelmed her. Walking into the grand rehearsal hall, surrounded by professional musicians tuning their instruments, Mai felt like an imposter. But then the conductor raised his baton, and with the first note, everything else faded away. She was just another violin in a sea of sound, her part weaving perfectly into the whole. Her fellow musicians were curious about her story. During breaks, they would gather around, asking questions about life at the diner. Some seemed surprised that a waitress could play at their level, but others shared their own unexpected paths to music. The third-chair violist had been a truck driver for years. One of the cellists still worked as a night nurse. Back at the diner, Things began to shift in subtle ways. Regular customers who had barely looked up from their newspapers now requested to sit in her section. Word had spread about the waitress who played in the symphony, and people treated her differently. Not because she was suddenly more worthy of respect, but because they finally saw her as a complete person. One morning, a young girl came in for breakfast with her mother. As Mai poured their orange juice, the girl tugged at her sleeve. "My mom says you play violin in the orchestra. I just started taking lessons. Do you think I could be in an orchestra too someday?" Mai looked at the hope shining in the girl's eyes and remembered her own childhood dreams. "Of course you can," she said, "if you love music and work hard. It doesn't matter where you start. It matters that you never stop believing in yourself." The hardest part was managing her energy. Some days, she would serve breakfast with arms still tired from the previous night's rehearsal. During particularly busy weeks, she would catch herself dozing off during orchestra breaks, exhausted from juggling both worlds. But the music energized her in a way that made all the fatigue worthwhile. Mr. Wu, who had watched her transformation from his kitchen window, started keeping a radio tuned to the classical station. The familiar melodies floated through the diner, and sometimes Mai would catch him conducting with his spatula when he thought no one was watching. Her first performance with the symphony was a turning point. Several of her regular customers came to watch, including the elderly man who had recognized her Bach tapping. They sat in the audience, beaming with pride as if she were their own daughter. Even more surprising were her co-workers. Lynn and 3 other waitresses had pooled their tips to buy tickets, showing up in their finest clothes to support her. After the concert, they all gathered at the diner for a late-night celebration. Mr. Wu stayed open past closing time, serving his special dumplings to a mixture of musicians and diner staff. The conversation flowed easily between both parts of Mei's world, and she realized that she no longer needed to keep them separate. One of her orchestra colleagues picked up a coffee pot, playfully attempting to pour cups for everyone. "This is harder than it looks," he admitted after nearly spilling. Mai laughed and demonstrated the proper technique, the same fluid movement she used to control her bow. "Everything is connected," she explained, guiding his hand. "Whether you're serving coffee or playing Mozart, it's all about finding the right balance, the perfect flow." The others nodded, understanding that she wasn't just talking about pouring coffee or playing music. She was talking about life itself. That night, as she hung up her concert clothes next to her diner uniform, Mai felt a deep sense of peace. The violin case propped against her dresser no longer seemed out of place next to her work shoes. She had proven that dignity wasn't about what you did for a living. It was about living authentically, embracing all the parts of yourself, even the ones that didn't seem to fit together at first. The morning sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, casting a golden glow on the familiar counter where Mai had spent countless hours of her life. Today felt different, though. It was her last morning at the Golden Pearl Diner. The symphony had offered her a full-time position, along with an opportunity to teach at the community music school. Her 2 worlds were finally merging into one. As she moved through her final shift, every small task felt meaningful. She memorized the sound of coffee pouring into cups, the gentle clink of plates being set down, the warm greetings of regular customers who had become like family. Each moment was a goodbye, but also a celebration of how far she had come. The regulars had found out about her departure, and throughout the morning they kept coming in, bringing small gifts and heartfelt words. The elderly man who first recognized her Bach tapping brought her a vintage music book. "For your future students," he said with a warm smile. A young mother whose daughter had started violin lessons after meeting Mai brought a card covered in wobbly musical notes drawn in crayon. Mr. Wu was quieter than usual in the kitchen, his spatula moving with less of its usual flair. During a slow moment, he called her to the kitchen window. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a carefully wrapped package. Inside was his mother's old recipe book, filled with handwritten notes in Chinese. "She wrote about music in here too," he explained, his voice soft. She believed cooking and music were the same. Both feed the soul. Lynn organized a surprise gathering during the afternoon lull. The staff had decorated a corner booth with streamers, and someone had brought in a cake with a tiny violin drawn in frosting. "You showed us that it's never too late to follow your dreams," Lynn said, giving Mai a tight hug. "But who's going to keep us entertained with humming now?" As Mai served her last few customers, she thought about how much had changed since that winter morning in the storage room, when she had hummed Tchaikovsky through her tears. The diner hadn't just been a workplace. It had been a cocoon, protecting her until she was ready to spread her wings again. Near closing time, the conductor from the symphony stopped by with unexpected news. The community music school wanted her to start a special program, teaching music to working adults who had put their dreams on hold. "Your story has inspired people," he explained. "There are others out there like you, waiting for a second chance." The idea of teaching brought tears to her eyes as she thought of Mrs. Chen, who had believed in her when she barely believed in herself. Now she could do the same for others, showing them that talent doesn't have an expiration date, and dreams don't become invalid just because life takes unexpected turns. At the end of her shift, Mai took off her name tag one last time. The tiny violin pin she had added months ago caught the light, reminding her of how far she had come. She carefully packed both items in her bag, not to hide them away, but to keep as reminders of this chapter of her life. The next morning, instead of donning her blue uniform, she dressed for her first day as a full-time musician. But first, she stopped by the Golden Pearl for breakfast, sitting at the counter like any other customer. It felt strange being on the other side, watching the morning rush unfold around her. Mr. Wu came out of the kitchen to serve her himself, placing a perfect omelette in front of her. "Musicians need a good breakfast," he said with a wink. As she ate, she noticed a young waitress humming while she worked, swaying slightly as she refilled coffee cups. Their eyes met, and Mai gave her an encouraging smile, recognizing the music in her movements. Later that day, as she unpacked her violin in the symphony hall, Mai found a napkin from the diner tucked into her case. On it, someone had written, "Thank you for showing us that every life has its own beautiful melody." She smoothed the napkin carefully and placed it next to her grandmother's photo in the violin case. The journey hadn't ended, it was just changing tempo. As she lifted her violin to join the orchestra's warm-up, Mai knew that every note she played carried the echoes of coffee cups and morning conversations, of early practices in the laundry room and late-night lessons with Mrs. Chen. She had learned that dignity wasn't about what you did, but how you did it, and that every person's life was a unique composition waiting to be played.